Knights Errant of the Wilderness. Tales of the Explorers of the Great Northwest by Morden H. Long. Published by the Macmillan Company, 1919. Read by Cody Cole, author of Auke-wingeke-tawso, or Defender of His Country, The Circumstances and Services of Charles Michel de Langlade. Preface plus Chapter 1. Henry Hudson. Preface. This book requires a word of explanation with regard to its character and aim. It makes no pretense whatever to research, but is simply an attempt to retell for the children of the upper public school grades some of the stories of the makers of the Canadian West, which have already been told for adults in the books of Lawrence Burpee, Agnes Lott, and others. Of the works of these writers, very free use have been made of the pages which follow, though, where original documents were readily available, as in the cases of the journals of Huron and Mackenzie, recourse has been had to them. If, then, the book presents in an attractive way for Canadian boys and girls some of the heroic deeds which underline the growing greatness of their own Northwest, its object will have been obtained. If it should happen that in spite of its simplicity the book makes an appeal also to some grown-ups, that will be the result, undesigned by the writer, though no less welcome to him. The writer wishes to acknowledge the very valuable assistance which he has received at every stage of the work from Miss L. F. Munro, principal of Bennett's School, Edmonton, and also the kindly encouragement which was afforded him in the undertaking by Mr. John T. Ross, Deputy Minister of Education for the province of Alberta, and by Mr. W. G. Carpenter, Superintendent of the Edmonton Public Schools. Grateful acknowledgment is due, too, to Mr. John Wise for the skill and faithfulness with which he has drafted the maps illustrating the stories. Chapter 1. Henry Hudson. In the heart of old London, wedged in amongst tall houses whose quaint chimney-pots look calmly down upon it, there stands a little old church of St. Ethelburga in Bishopsgate Street. Square and squat and grey, for many a century it has sturdily braved the buffeting storms and has afforded a quiet haven in the city's buzzy streets, where men may turn aside to think for a little while on the deep things of life. Thither many Sabbath morning, to clear summons of its tolling bell, peaceful citizens of London had gone to worship. On April 19th, 1607, however, there was added to the unusual quiet congregation a new, strange element. Just as the service was about to begin, 12 men came trooping in. Their bronzed faces, their roughened hands, their free, rolling gait, their sailors' clothes, all spoke of a life on the sea, far from the cramping bounds of London's shops and courting-houses. A little awkward they seemed, as though unused to church and its quaint ways. Yet they were not irrelevant. Their deep voices joined in musically with those of the congregation in the responses of the stately service of the Church of England. Respectfully, they listened to the message of the clergyman, and as they took the Holy Sacrament, their faces bore the solemn seriousness of men who were about to face hardships and perils and death itself in some high enterprise. Little, indeed, did the congregation know that this was the most glorious moment in the long history of the grey old church. Yet so it was, for the little group of 12 strange mariners numbered amongst it some of the bravest hearts in all England, and their leader, he with the air of command and steady, fearless eyes, was no less than Henry Hudson, one of the world's greatest navigators. So simply and with quiet earnestness did the party prepare itself to carry on the famous search for the northern route to the Indies, in which many skilled men had failed. Thus, too, did the little church witness the memorable beginning of a series of explorations which were to lay for England claims to vast new dominions overseas and bring Henry Hudson an imperishable fame. 4 days later, at Gravesend on the Thames, Hudson embarked on his first voyage to the icy Arctic seas. His little ship, the Hopewell, had been fitted out by the great Muscovy Company, which carried on an extensive trade with Russia by way of the Archangel on the White Sea. Along the caravan routes of Central Asia, there had come to Russia some of the skills and spices and jewels of the East. Thus, English merchants had been set dreaming of the wonderful wealth that would be theirs if only a short sea route could be found to India, Japan, and Cathay. Vasco da Gama, sent out by the King of Portugal, had reached those far distant lands by rounding the Cape of Good Hope and crossing the Indian Ocean. Magellan, dispatched by Spain, had found a way to them by sailing around the southern extremity of South America and boldly striking out across the vast, uncharted expanse of the Pacific. But both these routes were very long and beset by many perils. Moreover, Portugal and Spain claimed them as their own by right of discovery, and attacked the ships of all other nations which attempted to sail those seas. If English seamen, however, could only discover another shorter path to the Far East, that new route would be England's very own, and the merchants of London and Bristol would reap riches untold. So Hudson was now sent forth in his tiny vessel to make his way to those lands of spicery by sailing north across the Polar Sea. With him, in addition to the crew of 10 seamen, Hudson took his little son, John. Many a time had the lad sat wide-eyed in wonder at his father's stirring tales of distant lands and wild adventures on the seas. Often had he longed for the time when he might throw lessons and school books to the wind, and take his part in the brave doings of those days. And now, at last, that time had come, and the little lad was all agog with excitement and eager to be off with his father on his adventurous voyage. North they sailed past John O'Groats, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Faroes, and Iceland, until they were well within the Arctic Circle, where in a short summer's rain almost perpetual day. Then suddenly a dense fog which had beset them listed. Though it was 2 o'clock in the morning, it was broad daylight, and the watchman's cry of "Land to larboard" brought the captain and men tumbling quickly to deck. There, towering above the western horizon, and gilded by the rays of the rising sun, were the snowy peaks of the mountains of Greenland, while all about the little ship, to north, east, south, lay an endless floating world of ice. Still north they sailed with the bleak shores of Greenland to the west, until the ever-thickening ice floes drove them the fact that no passage lay this way across the pole. Then, in July, they turned their prow northeast toward Spitzbergen, but here too they found that path to the north, and endless ice packs barred the way to their goal. So September 15th found Hudson and his crew once more on the Thames at Tilbury Dock. In the main object of their search they had failed, yet the voyage had not been a complete failure. They had proved that no route lay past Greenland or Spitzbergen to the Orient. They brought back definite knowledge of the wealth of the northern seas in whales, seals, and walrus. Hudson had reached the latitude of 82, just 8 degrees from the pole. He had been the first to record the dip of the compass in high latitudes from the true north towards the magnetic pole. He had also been the first to discover the great Arctic current, setting towards the pole, which later Nansen was to try and use in drifting towards that goal. But to Hudson, failure was only a challenge to the great faith and purpose that inspired him. In the very next year, 1608, he and his sons were once more in the north, this time trying to find a passage east through the straits between New Zembla and the mainland. But again, the great ice barrier, and a crew terrified by the hardships and dangers of a quest, compelled him to turn back. Quote, "Being devoid of hope, the wind stormed against us, much ice strong, we weighed anchor and set sail westward," end quote, Hudson writes in his log. On August 20th, they anchored in the Thames. Cast off now by the Muscovy Company, Hudson was next employed by its great rival, the Dutch East India Company, and the summer of 1609 found him, once more, off for New Zambia. This time he sailed from Amsterdam in a little flat-bottomed cockshell of a boat called the Half Moon. Unfortunately, more than half of Hudson's crew were cowardly, naive sailors from the Dutch East India Company. These men, lightly clad, used only to sunny southern seas, and shivering with cold and terror, took to the warm blankets in their berths when the North Cape had been left behind. Thereupon, the English sailors promptly rebelled against the double work, and all hope of carrying on Arctic exploration for that year at last came to an end. Sadly, the captain turned his ship back towards the west. But if Hudson returned, having once more failed in his search, he knew that his career as a navigator would be ended in disgrace. What was he to do? Whither might he turn? Long he pondered this question, and at last he struck southwest, with a fair wind across the Atlantic. Between the French on the St. Lawrence and Virginia, where his best friend, Captain Smith, had but lately founded the first permanent English colony in America, old maps showed an unexplored arm of the ocean. Perhaps this was a passage through America to the Pacific or Western Sea, the discovery of which would bring fame and wealth instead of the impending disgrace. So Hudson and his half-mutinous crew coasted south along the Atlantic shore to Chesapeake, and then, turning north again on September 2nd, 1609, the ships entered a spacious harbor at the mouth of a great river. This river we now call the Hudson, after its discoverer. On the lonely wooded shores, which a solitary Indian signal fire then sent its sender smoke column aloft into the air, there towers now the mighty skyline of New York, the metropolis of America and one of the largest cities in the world. Little dreaming of the great future of the land which they saw, Hudson and his mariners ascended the river to the neighborhood where Albany now stands. There the captain was entertained by an old chief of the country. Quote, "He was chief of a tribe of 40 men and 17 women," end quote, Hudson says. Quote, "These I saw there in a house well built of oak bark, circular in shape with an arched roof. It contained a great quantity of Indian corn and beans of last year's growth, and there lay near the house for the purpose of drying enough to load 3 ships, besides what was growing in the fields. On our coming into the house, 2 mats were spread to sit upon, and food was served in well-made wooden bowls. 2 men were also dispatched at once with bows and arrows in search of game, who soon brought in a pair of pigeons which they had shot. They likewise killed a fat dog and skinned it in great haste with shells which they had got out of the water. The land is the finest for cultivation that I have ever set foot upon in my life. The natives are very good people, for when they saw that I would not remain, they supposed that I was afraid of their bows, and taking the arrows, they broke them in pieces and threw them in the fire." End quote. On September 23rd, the shallows of the upper Hudson caused them to retrace their course to the mouth of the river, and thence, putting forth to sea, they reached Dartmouth in England on November 7th. Hudson had failed again to find the Northwest Passage which he sought, but he had discovered a great river destined to be the main gateway to the trade of the New World. So jealous now of their Dutch rivals were the gentlemen of the Muscovy Company that they secured an order from the government forbidding Hudson to return to Holland. Henceforth, they were resolved, his services must be only given to his native land. On April 16th, 1610, Hudson embarked on his last and greatest voyage. 3 members of the Muscovy Company, Sir Thomas Smith, Sir Dudley Biggs, and Master John Wolstenholme, men who had faith in Hudson and his dream of a Northwest Passage, joined in equipping the expedition. A little ship of 150 tons, happily named the Discovery, was fitted out and manned with a crew of 20 men. Among these were several of Hudson's old seamen and his son, John, the constant companion of his father in his voyages. Dropping down the peaceful Thames with his tide, the little company looked their last on the pleasant land of England, clad in the soft green of April and decked with the flowers of spring. Far other indeed were the scenes for which they were bound. By mid-May they had reached the rocky coast of Iceland, where, according to Thomas Pickett, one of the members of the crew who kept a diary of the voyage, quote, "We saw that famous hill, Mount Hecla, which cast out much fire, and on the shore we found a hot spring, and here all our Englishmen bathed themselves." End quote. For a fortnight they sheltered in Icelandic coves against adverse winds and drifting ice. Then, sailing boldly to the west, they rounded the southern point of Greenland, crossed the entrance to Davis Strait, and about 20th of June reached Resolution Island. This lay at the mouth of the great strait which both Frobisher and Davis had noticed in their expeditions, and through which Hudson was now convinced lay the way to the Western Sea. Here he stood on the threshold of his work. They were upon the edge of the known world, and were about to plunge into the vast unknown beyond. Their task was no child's play. The giant icebergs in the Strait of North America were as mountainous to little hills compared to the ice floes of the open sea that Hudson had encountered on his previous Arctic voyages. In our own day, huge islands of ice, 9 miles in length by actual measurement, have been encountered in Ungava Bay. To make matters worse, into the narrow straits, and dead against the packed and jumbled ice drifting, with the polar current south and east, there flings itself the westward sweepings inrush of the Arctic tide. Thus is created what early navigators called the furious overflow, a great seething whirlpool of ice and water extremely dangerous to ships. All through July, Hudson with dauntless courage and stubbornly battled his way through the midst of the perils of the strait that now bears his name. Sometimes they slipped down the long lanes or tickles of open water between the floes. Sometimes they sought shelter in the calmer water in the lee of some great iceberg. Again, the men had to work desperately in the boats to tow the ship out of some dangerous positions, or else, armed with stout steel-tipped poles, they worked for dear life, thrusting away masses of ice that threatened to crush the sides of the ship. Sometimes they could make progress only by, quote, worming a way through, end quote, that is, anchoring the ship to the floes ahead, and then hauling it up to them by pulling on the connected rope. Often, too, they were compelled to sail north or south, but always they edged over further and further to the west, where they thought the great goal of the open sea must lie. In the midst of their toil came some diversions. Often they beheld whales spouting in the distance, and on the floes they sometimes saw great polar bears. Thus one day, Pickett writes, quote, "We raised land to the north, and coming nigh it there hung on the easternmost point many islands of floating ice, and a bear on one of them, which from one to another came towards us till she was ready to come aboard. But when she saw us look at her, she cast her head down between her hind legs, and then dived under the ice, and so from one piece to another till she was out of our reach." End quote. At last they reached the western end of the strait, where 2 great headlands were seen. The southern one Hudson named Cape Wolstenholme, the northern Diggs's Island, and to the latter he sent a landing party. Gaining a footing with difficulty on the rugged coast, the seamen went inland. Deer were seen in abundance, and immense flocks of wild fowl rose in alarm at their approach and circled in the air with loud flapping wings. They came across little mounds of stone which Pickett says, upon examination proved to be, quote, hollow within and full of fowls hanged by their necks, end quote. These were Eskimo caches containing food for the winter. But best of all, a thing which made every heart beat high with hope, from the hilltop they saw a great sea free of ice spreading out before them to the southwest, far as the eye could reach. When Hudson heard the good news, without delay, he steered the Discovery straight for the spacious open water. At last, he thought, I have reached the Western Sea. Quote, now I shall sail across it to Cathay. When my ship returns to England laden with the riches of the East, I shall receive a welcome that, like that Drake, when he came back from the great voyage around the world." End quote. Buoyed up by his triumphant hope, Hudson paced the deck, proud and erect, and eagerly scanned the great unknown water that was opening up before him. But as day after day pressed onward to the south, misgivings, which the great heart of Hudson would not heed, began to press the minds of his less heroic crew. The ship was provisioned for only a year. It was now September, and 6 months had passed. Hudson Strait would soon freeze up behind them. It would not be open again before June of the next year. If this should not prove to be the Western Sea, then they would be winter-bound in an unknown land. Twin horrors, starvation, and the rigors of the Arctic winter loomed up before them, and the dread fires of mutiny started to smolder amongst the crew. For a time, Hudson checked this danger by deposing the mate, Robert Juet, an old seaman, who from the very beginnings of the voyage had been a grumbler and mischief-maker, and appointing Robert Billet in his place. But when at last they reached James Bay, and all further progress south and west was barred by land, the full danger of their situation dawned upon them. From that moment, Hudson went in ever-growing peril from his crew. Until the 1st of November, they sailed thither and thither, seeking a way out of James Bay, that, quote, labyrinth without end, as they called it. When they hauled their ship aground, probably in what is now Rupert Bay, they prepared for the winter. By November 10th, the new-forming ice had gripped the ship fast, and the hardships of winter had already begun. The cold was intense, and the decks and port windows were soon coated with frost. But fortunately, there was plenty of firewood ashore for cutting. Stone fireplaces were built aboard, and pans of shot, heated red-hot, were taken to warm the berths at night. The ship's surgeon, a Dutchman, made medicine from the leaves of some strange evergreen shrubs, which proved an excellent remedy for the scurvy and other ills which had assailed the crew. Luckily, too, the woods were alive with game, especially partridge and white patarman, and so Hudson was able to put his men on short allowance of ship's provisions, thus saving more of their stores for the spring. But all the time trouble was brewing. Juet, the disposed mate, was cunningly plotting to get his revenge. The men began to openly oppose the captain, and Henry King, the carpenter, then commanded to build a house on shore, bluntly refused. Worst of all the mutineers was a young man, Henry Green. He was a worthless fellow whom Hudson in bigness of heart had picked from the London streets. Treating him like a son, the captain had taken him into his own home. Now, when Hudson gave to another coat of a dead sailor to Green, whom it had been promised, turned against his master, and foully plotted his overthrow. With the early spring, there came to the ships the first Indian whom they had seen. Hudson treated him in a friendly fashion, presenting him, to his great delight, with a knife, a looking-glass, and some buttons. The next day the Indian returned, dragging after him in a toboggan on which were 2 deer and 2 beaver skins. Quote, he had a scrip under his arm, out of which he drew those things which the master had given him. He took the knife and laid it upon one of the beaver skins, and his glass and buttons upon the other, and so gave them to the master, who received them. And the native took those things which the master had given him, and put them up into his scrip again. Then the master showed him a hatchet, which he would have given the master one of his deer skins, but our master would have had them both. And so he had, although not willingly. After many signs of people to the north and south, and that after so many sleeps he would come again, he went away, but never came no more. End quote. Thus, in the bargaining of Henry Hudson with this lone Indian, began the long history of the fur trade on Hudson Bay. And now, in May, when the ice was breaking up, it was time to prepare for the return voyage. Hudson commanded that birds and fish be taken and cured to refill their depleted stores. Unfortunately, there were some of the crew who neglected to do their share in the work. and these were the very ones who were the first to cause trouble when later the stock of provisions ran low. Early in June they were ready to set sail, but first Hudson, calling the men on deck, made an equal division of food amongst them. For each man there was just 1 pound of bread. He wept as he gave it to them. There was also some fish, and 9 cheeses to be divided among them. This must last till they reached Digges Island, at the mouth of the strait, where they had found such an abundance of wild fowl, and the well-filled Eskimo caches. As they sailed slowly north, always impeded by the floating ice, their situation steadily grew worse. Green and some others devoured all their food in a few hours, and soon became hungry and desperate. The captain had once threatened to leave behind on the bay anyone found guilty of plotting against him. Now this turned into an evil thought in the mind of the traitor Green. When Juet and Billet, whose places as mate had been given to King, he went cunningly around those of the crew who they thought could be won over to mutiny. "It is better," Green said, "to run the risk of hanging at home than to starve slowly to death here in the ice. Let us put the 9 sick men, the captain, and all those who stand by him in the boat, and set them adrift to shift for themselves. Then there will be food enough for us who are left, and we shall get home safely," Green said. Thus spake the base traitor, and, in the ears of all the starving crew, his counsel found favor. So all through the short midsummer night of June 21st, 1611, the mutineers kept stealthy watch, lest one of them should warn the captain of his peril. Then, with the dawn, when the faithful mate King, who had slept on deck, went below, the hatches were closed quickly upon him, and 3 others, Thomas, Bennett, and Wilson, took station by the door of the captain's cabin to await his coming on deck. So soon as the door opened, and Hudson, all unsuspecting, stepped forth. As Thomas and Bennett advanced towards him with insolent boldness, Wilson crept up behind and suddenly seized his arms. Quickly the captain was bound and stood helpless before them. Then King, the mate, who had secured a sword in the hold, and was bravely defending himself against the attacks of Juet, was saved from immediate death by some of the mutineers, who were not willing to do open murder, and was allowed to join as captain. Under the direction of the treacherous Green, who now took command, the sick and those lamed by frostbite during the winter were cruelly ordered on deck, and with Hudson, his son, and the mate, were tumbled into the ship's boat. Then arose oaths and a scuffle, and there was a burst forth among the mutineers, from a sailor named Philip Staife. "Ye villains," he cried, quote, "you will all hang for this when you get back to England. Unless you force me, I will not stay on the ship. Give me my chest of tools, and I will go in the boat with my master." End quote. So they let him go, a true-hearted Englishman, resolved to follow his duty even to death. Into the boat, along with the carpenter's box, was thrown a gun, some powder, a shot, an iron pot, and a little meal. Throughout this shameful scene, Hudson had borne himself with courage and dignity. Seeing that the crew had the upper hand and resolved on their murderous course, he uttered neither angry protests nor weak pleas for his life. His arms being unbound by those in the boat, he now took his place at the tiller, calmly facing his mate, and upborne by the duty of caring for the helpless men whose sole hope lay in him. When they had towed them free of the ice, the black and cowardly deed was finished by one of the mutineers cutting the rope and setting the little boat adrift. More quickly now the wind bore the ship onward until the lonely boat was but a speck in the distance. But even long after it had been completely lost to view, the scowling, shame-faced mutineers gazed fearfully behind them, even their hardened consciousness stricken with the guilt of the deed which they had done. From such a foul crime, good could not come. Quarreling continued amongst themselves, and lacking their master's navigation skills, The crew quickly sailed blindly on as best they could. When they reached Digges Island, Green and 3 others met the fate which they deserved at the hands of the Eskimos, who treacherously murdered them when they landed ashore. Without having obtained the provisions which they sought, the rest battled their way slowly eastwards through the strait and out into the Atlantic. In the long voyage to Ireland they suffered untold agonies of hunger. The cook had to make meals from tallow candles, frying the bones of the wild fowl in them and seasoning the dish with vinegar. So weak did they become that they could no longer stand at the helm, but sat and steered the ship. As she tossed upon the waves, the sails flapped wildly loose with no man minding them. Jouet, the guilty old mate, died of sheer starvation. The ship seemed doomed, pursued and haunted by the dreadful crime committed by the crew. But at last one day there came the cry of land, a sail. They had reached Ireland. Thence they sailed to England, where they were placed on trial for their mutiny. But what of Hudson and his castaways? All England was filled with sorrow at his sad fate. The very next year Captain Thomas Button, with 2 ships, the Discovery and Resolution, were sent to search for the lost mariner, and if he was still lived, to be rescued. They spent the winter of 1612-13 on Hudson Bay, but the great discoverer they found no trace. 20 years after Captain James found on Danby Island a number of stakes hewn with a steel hatchet and driven into the ground. 50 years later, Radisson discovered a, quote, old house all marked and battered with bullets, end quote, as though it had been attacked by Indians, armed perhaps with firelocks supplied by French traders at Quebec. Were these the relics of the brave struggle of Hudson and his men against death at the hands of hostile natives? Or did they die of starvation in their little open boat, which then drifted aimless on until it stranded and rotted on the shore? Or did some great storm suddenly engulf them and thus mercifully end their sufferings? No one knows. But we do know, whatever his end, Henry Hudson would meet it with the same high courage with which he had sailed through perilous unknown seas and had faced a mutinous crew. We know that, if need arose, he would confront death bravely, trying to save the sick men committed to his keeping. But as to the actual way in which he perished, that is a secret which lies tightly locked forever in the bosom of the broad bay that bears his name. End of chapter 1.